Thank you, Amy, for reading Psalm 23 for us. I want you to picture Jesus as a baby, Mary holding him in her arms, singing the Psalms. See him as a boy at home with his brothers and sisters and his mother and Joseph, singing the Psalms. Now as a teenager going to the synagogue in Nazareth, singing the Psalms. As a man in Capernaum every Sabbath day, singing the Psalms. In the upper room, celebrating the Passover the night before his crucifixion, both Matthew and Mark tell us, along with his disciples, singing the Psalms. From boyhood to young manhood to adulthood, Jesus read and knew and loved and sung the Psalms. The Hebrew hymn book, for thousands of years the songbook of the Jews, and the hymn book, the songbook that Jesus used. Of course, there are 150 Psalms, the longest, Psalm 119 with 176 verses, the shortest, Psalm 117 with just 2 verses, but by far the best known, Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Spurgeon, the 19th century Prince of Preachers, said, it's a precious peril. In fact, it's been called the John 3:16 of the Old Testament. A psalm, a song for dark days and difficult times. Penned, composed by David, the shepherd boy come king. It's his very own personal testimony, his God story. Many psalms are prayers and pleas, but not this one. It's all praise. And it's a clear statement of faith. The Lord, the covenant God, Jehovah God, is my shepherd. I have a living relationship with him, says David. Don't forget, it's part of a trilogy. Psalm 22, Psalm 23, Psalm 24 are messianic psalms, basically the whole sweep of God's salvation plan ahead of time. 1,000 years before he came, it's all about Jesus, rescuing, rising, reigning, and returning. And needless to say, Psalm 23 verse 1 is key to everything. The rest flows from that opening sentence. Because the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. All I ever need is found in him. He is enough. And verse 2, he makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. The picture is one of rest and refreshment. Today, verse 3, restoration and righteousness. First of all, restoration. He restores my soul. Okay, grab your cap and your coat and let's head to North Wales or the Lake District. Imagine we're in a farmer's field. Actually, most modern sheep farmers use drones and quad bikes to check in their sheep. So we need to go much further back to Bible times. And we need to put ourselves in David's shoes, in his shepherd's sandals. Last week, you remember we discovered the shepherd would allow his sheep to go and graze in green pasture. And then it was time to stop and rest. Well, sheep being sheep don't know what's good for them, so the loving shepherd has to settle them down. In a book I've got in my study, A Shepherd's Look at Psalm 23, Phil Keller says that the shepherd has to force the issue. And the emphasis is he has to make them lie down. He puts his hand on their head, he grabs them by the ears, and he pushes them down. And one or two will eventually lie down and the others will follow suit. And also sheep are easily scared, especially when there's water, fast flowing water. So the shepherd gets into the river, pulls the rocks, boulders from the river bank and dams up the river and creates a pool so that the sheep can calmly drink to their heart's content. Well, Keller also tells us sheep are not just skittish and scared, they're silly and stubborn as well, always wandering off. And if they're not careful, they'll end up in trouble, fall into a ravine, or maybe a wild animal will have them for dinner. Keller was a farmer in East Africa, and he knew if he looked up into the sky and saw a buzzard or a vulture or a bird of prey circling overhead, then one of his sheep was in difficulty or in danger. Maybe it had flipped over and it was on its back with its legs in the air and unable to get back on its feet. Its wool too heavy, maybe if there's been heavy rain, its woolly jumper saturated and soaked, and it couldn't get back on its feet. Others would maybe lie down near a hole or a hollow in the ground and tip in and roll over and end up stuck. And Keller says he had one particular sheep, and this happened regularly, and he and his son had to check several times a day. And if they didn't, within a couple of hours, that sheep would have been a goner. Listen, the big danger for us just now isn't running off somewhere. There's nowhere to go, is there? But we're at home. No routine. No Christian community, no real accountability, and it's easy to become stuck spiritually. Just marking time, everything on hold. Tomorrow Christians, someday believers. And before we know it, we're in a hole on our backs, not doing the dying fly, but the dying sheep, legs kicking, blood draining, in trouble and in danger. Well, I've got news for you. Good news. The shepherd is on the case, and he's seen us, and he's out to rescue us and get us back on our feet again. Maybe we're repeat offenders, and we're spiritually far away from where we used to be, and maybe we don't even care. Straying and stubborn sheep. Well, again, according to Keller, with such sheep, the shepherd has to take some severe steps. It might seem harsh, but he's being cruel to be kind. He wants to teach his sheep. He wants to discipline them for their good. In his hand, he has a staff or a crook. In his other hand, he has a rod or a club. And this rod, this club is used to scatter the wolves or any predatory animal. And if they came too close, then he would scare them away with his rod. Next week in verse 4, we're going to discover your rod and your staff, they comfort me. The flock were reassured when they saw the shepherd was armed and ready to rumble when he had his rod. He would protect them from the foe. So he would use the rod for protection. But he would also use it for something else. It was an instrument of correction. He would take his rod, his club, and he would break the leg of the wayward lamb. And then he would quickly bathe that leg and put it in a splint. And then for the next number of days, weeks, he would carry that lamb close to his heart, hold it in his arms, and eventually he would let it down. And if you did a sheep survey, you would find that every time you saw a lamb close to the shepherd, that lamb had been through the splint experience and they had learned their lesson the hard way. He had turned them back. That's the meaning of the word here in the verse. He restores my soul lovingly and yet firmly. He brings us back. He brings us into line. He brings us to heel, as it were, so we won't wander off again. Well, without much bother, we see ourselves here, don't we? The face, the man in the mirror is me. Have a look. It's you too, isn't it? The Bible tells us all we like sheep have gone astray. Peter says the very same thing, and then this, but we have returned to the shepherd of our souls. And Peter knew what he was talking about. He denied and deserted. Thankfully, though, he returned, and Jesus, the shepherd, restored him. He even gave him a job to do. From the university of hard knocks and bitter experience, Peter was able to shepherd the flock of Christ. Of course, David had a similar story. David went AWOL and he ended up in a mess. But thankfully, his divine shepherd wouldn't let his straying sheep go. Instead, he went after him and found him and brought him home, brought him back and restored him again. And it wasn't just a one-off thing. David was the same as us. And yet, having been restored to the fold, God, the shepherd, entrusted David with a ministry. That's why we have Psalm 23. In fact, listen to what David says. Until God dealt with me, until God brought me to my knees, before I was afflicted, before I was disciplined, before, if you like, I went through the splint experience, David says, I went astray. David acknowledges he realized that the shepherd's rod was used out of love for him to bring him into line. In the New Testament, Paul says, God disciplines those he loves. I wonder, do you need restoring? Do you need brought back? Could it be that's what the shepherd is doing just now? It's not so much about what's going on around us. No, it's more about what's going on in us, in here, the inner life. Again, Paul says, don't despise the chastening of God. Don't kick against God's correction. So, restoration. Next, righteousness. He restores my soul and he leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And this is so important for us to understand. The path of righteousness means the right path. The right path as opposed to the wrong path. Once we're in this road, the wrong road. Now we're in this road, the right road. This path over here led to difficulty and disaster and danger and even death. In fact, the Bible says there's a way that seems to be right, but the end is the way of death. But the role and the goal of the shepherd is to bring us back so that we then walk differently and distinctly and rightly in a way that pleases him. Earlier we mentioned David, who said, "Before I was afflicted, before God disciplined me, I went astray, but now, having been chastened by God, I obey. I keep the law." The lambs, the sheep that have gone through the splint experience, stop straying and start to stay on track. You remember Jesus with his disciples, he did the very same. They had issues, the same traits and traps. And I guess it's epitomized in Peter. We mentioned Peter earlier on. But Peter, the Peter that we see in the book of Acts, is not the same Peter we see in the Gospels. He's changed. And the Peter we see in his letters has changed again. It's been a long journey for Peter, a lifelong journey, learning lots of lessons. Yes, slips and stumbles and fits and starts. And yet the overall direction is forward. It's one of development and it's one of growth. And that's what the divine shepherd wants to see in us as well. The discipline, the lessons to affect us, to work, to impact us, so that we begin to walk on the right path. This is a picture that Paul uses repeatedly in his epistles. He says, "Walk worthy of your calling." Elsewhere he says, "Walk in step with the Spirit." And yes, notice, would you please, this is all for our good, but primarily it's for his glory. It's for his name's sake. The shepherd's reputation is at stake. If he has lots of rebellious, stubborn sheep running off here, there and everywhere in all directions, what's the conclusion? He's not a very good shepherd. It reflects badly on him. Whereas when we submit to the shepherd and keep close to the shepherd, stay in step with the shepherd, who gets the credit? Him. Absolutely. In the Old Testament, the nation of Israel is pictured as the flock of God, and they were a nightmare. They were disobedient. They were wandering off all the time. And the Bible tells us their wandering caused the heathen, the ungodly nations to mock God. If that's what his people are like, then he can't be a very good God. He's not worth following. And it's the same with us. So the shepherd leads us in paths of righteousness, the right path. And he does it for his name's sake, for his glory. Well, there we have it. Restoration and righteousness. The process of restoration and the path of righteousness. I wonder, is Psalm 23 verse 3 just for you? What's this saying to you? What's God saying to you? What's the shepherd saying to you? I want to restore you. I want to set you on the right road. What does lockdown look like? Spiritually. Where's your heart? What about the state of your soul? How is it between you and the shepherd and you? What about closeness to him? With his help, breaking habits of a lifetime, quickly confessing sin, regularly repenting and running and returning to the shepherd's side. A psalm for all seasons. A psalm for this season, for this time, for today. Written 3,000 years ago, fulfilled in Jesus 2,000 years ago, but for us, right here, right now. We're into week 6, aren't we? Almost 50 days And it feels a lot longer, but listen, could it be that we'll look back on these days as defining days? Lockdown 2020, life changing. Under the shepherd's rod, it was a time to recalculate. I've got a sat-nav in my car and it needs updating, and across the Mersey on the new bridge, and the lady begins to panic. She says, recalculate, recalculate, recalculate. Is that what we need to do? Recalculate, reprioritize, or reboot, whatever word you want to use, whatever analogy you like, and return to Jesus. Return to the shepherd's side. Let's not leave lockdown the same. And finally, if you've never been under the shepherd's care, that's exactly where you have to be. Come to him. Jesus, the good shepherd, gave his life, laid down his life for the sheep. Here's the gospel. The shepherd became a lamb. It's a contrast, but it's not a contradiction. Psalm 23, we said at the beginning, is part of a trilogy. It sits alongside Psalm 22, all about the cross. And before we can enjoy Psalm 23, we need to appreciate all that Jesus did on the cross. And that's where you've got to begin. Then the profound truth of Psalm 23 can be a reality for you. Let me end by telling you about Robert Robinson. He was from Norfolk. His dad died when he was 5, and basically he was passed from pillar to post as a child. 14, he went to London to become a barber, but that's where he trusted in Jesus Christ and became a Christian. And he started to write hymns from a teenager. But then after a while, with one thing and another, he grew cold, spiritually cold, and drifted, and ended up 1,000,000 miles from where he once was. And then one day it happened. He was on a stagecoach. It was back in the late 1700s. But he sat beside someone who was humming a song, a hymn he had actually written years and years before. And like an arrow, it pierced his very soul, his own hymn. And the hymn was this: Come thou fount of every blessing, and tune my heart to sing thy praise. And the lines that spoke to him and challenged him were these: Jesus sought me when a stranger, wandering from the fold of God. And then this: prone to wander, Lord, I feel it, prone to leave the God I love. Here's my heart. Oh, take and seal it for thy courts above. And Robert Robinson's soul was restored. And from that point on, he lived the rest of his life for the glory of Jesus Christ. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Let's sing the song together and make it the prayer of our hearts.